It's just that.
Hey guys, this is Nirupam from the Underwater Photography Guide and Bluewater Photo. We are trying YouTube Live for the first time, so this is kind of an exciting thing for us. Today I'm here with Sallmon from CNC, and we wanted to announce that the CNC YS-D2J is officially discontinued. Bluewater Photo was the last company that really had these strobes available. We've run out, they're gone, there's no more. And what's exciting about that is the YS-D3s have really become an awesome replacement for those strobes. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about why the YS-D3s are such a great replacement for the D2Js, the YS-250s, and older versions of CNC strobes, as well as other strobes on the market. I think the D3s are just an all-around great workhorse strobe. So we're going to run through a couple of our photos, talk about some specs, and just let you guys check out the D3s.
All right, cool. Thanks everybody for tuning in and watching us here. Hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions for you as to why you might want to upgrade from your D2J or your YS-250 or whatever else you've got out there. So we're going to focus on the D3 and talk about some of the enhancements over the previous and older models. And we'll jump right in with both feet. So first of all, the YS-D3, our latest strobe, has two iterations. There's a YS-D3 Mark I and a YS-D3 Mark II. We made a running change. We kept the same part numbers and everything. So everything's pretty much same. Externally, you probably wouldn't even notice the difference, but we made a slight ergonomic change to the control knobs on the back of it. It's an improvement for the most part, but they're fairly similar. And that's why I said you probably wouldn't even notice it unless you actually grabbed it from the button and knob end. Internally, there are some other changes, though. On the market, there's a lot of new cameras all the time, especially in the compact world. It seems like there's a new camera every 5 to 6 months. And we were finding that a lot of the users prefer TTL through the lens, metered, pretty much automatic flash underwater. So the original D3 Mark I wasn't working with some of the cameras that were newer than it was, and also wasn't working with some of the third-party TTL converters that were on the market for some of the other larger pro-end, maybe mirrorless cameras and DSLRs out there. So we made a running change, upgraded the electronics, and your D3s can be upgraded as well. So if you've got a newer camera and you're having TTL problems with a YS-D3 Mark I, you can send it in, and in a matter of minutes we can upgrade it. The biggest downtime will be just the posting it back and forth to CNC Tusa in California and Long Beach. So those are the differences there between the Mark II and the D3. So I don't want anyone to think that they've got to rush out and buy Mark IIs and that their D3s are obsolete. I've got a D3 sitting here on my desk, and that's still half of what I use basically. So I've got a set of those. I've got a couple of sets of the Mark IIs, and for my purposes, I haven't noticed a difference. So that's a little bit of a lead in, and there's been a little bit of confusion about that, which there usually is. Anytime something new comes along right on the heels of an initial product development, everybody's like, oh gosh, did they create a lemon? No, we did not create a lemon. So it's just a running change to the firmware and a little tiny ergonomic change because we got a couple complaints. So what I want to do now is just make some big comparisons between the YS-D3 and the YS-D2J mainly. And Nirupam, if I forget a couple things I wanted to say about it compared to the YS-250 as well, because the YS-250 was the strobe that I used 100% of the time, except for maybe macro because it was so large.
Right.
And I used YS-D2s, D2Js for the macro shooting that I did. But now everything in my kit has been replaced by YS-D3. And for one thing, I saved net, I carry 4 or 5 strobes typically everywhere I go, but that means you're carrying chargers, batteries, etc. So the net amount that I saved by switching from YS-250s and YS-D2Js, my little backup macros, I saved 14 pounds of baggage. I can actually almost get that's big. I can almost get down to the 50-pound limit, but not quite. So I'm still paying overage fees, but it's still a lot easier for everybody to handle. And the people that collect your baggage at the airline don't grunt so much when they go across the counter. And sometimes they let you slide on that extra 4 or 5 pounds. But anyway, saved 14 pounds net from running with a couple of 3 YS-250s and 2 D2Js net with batteries, chargers, and everything that went with them.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
that's
I'm
a big.
kind of like I'm a YS-D2J shooter, and I'd say if you're going from the D2J, you probably won't notice the difference, which is also a nice thing. So, um,
The other thing I did, and then what you won't have to remember to remind me about the 250 is the first thing when I got a D3, we unfortunately we were kind of born into the fire world of COVID, so everybody was like, oh, that's back when we were flattening the curve and wondering if this is the end of the world and the Spanish flu, or just a super serious bad flu-like disease that was going around the world, and none of us knew anything. So diving pretty much went to a standstill. I know here in San Diego, they wouldn't even let us out on the dive boats for the first 6 weeks or so, and then of course it all had to be masks and distancing and all that stuff. Anyway, so the poor old D3 came out right in about the middle of that. We started taking delivery right around March of 2020, and as you know, that's when the world kind of got shut down for a while. So took him out in the garage, hooked him up to a camera, one D3 on one side, YS-250 on the other side, and against a darked out garage just to see what they would actually do. So I had frame by frame by frame by frame, went through, I don't know, 4 different f-stops. I didn't use all the f-stops because I don't shoot real wide open very often. And who's worried about f/22? They both got a high enough guide number, so I wasn't worried about that. I was more worried about my wide angle stops, which are
right.
5.6, f8, f11, maybe 16 on a really bright. And I thought the 250 would probably beat the poor little D3, but it didn't. That was a shock. That
Yeah.
was truly a shock to the system. Here's this little tiny strobe with 4 AA batteries in it, and it is competing right in there, just like a 250. The output, the recycle time, once in a while the 250 would beat it a little bit, and oddly enough, even more surprisingly, every once in a while there'd be a situation where the D3 would slightly beat the 250, but we're not talking about much. I mean, these were third of a stop, barely perceptible amounts, and for all I know, it could have been ghost in the works, and maybe I had a really souped up D3 and my 250 was just getting a little too old, although I was using one of my newer 250s for that. So anyway, it compared extremely well in wide angle apertures to a 250, at which point then when I started looking at the weight difference, I was like, well, 250s, sorry, you're retired now.
Yeah.
So
And
that's gone.
for those shooters that don't really know too much about the 250s, the 250s were kind of the workhorse, like professional strobe back in the day, and they're much bigger than the D3s. The D3 size is more like what we would nowadays consider mid-range strobe, but you're getting performance that's a lot more professional.
Yeah. So some of the different specifications to kind of contrast what you're looking at if you're a D2J shooter. I'm not going to say anything else about the 250. I think that's enough said. But a D2J, comes out about the same weight. They're very close and similar in some ways. But the biggest primary generalized difference, I think, between the D3 and the D2J is internal. And that is that we completely redid the electronics in this thing. This was like the remodel of your old house and you turned it into your palace. This thing inside is sweet. It's got 2 of the largest condensers or capacitors that we could find. And the recycle time is fast. Now, that said, at full power, technically, compared to a D2J, it's about 0.2 of a second slower. However, don't use full power that often. It's important, but we don't usually count on rapid firing because, hey, let's face it, both of them are in the 1.5 to 1.7 second category. You're not going to rapid fire too much there. You're not going to, what our cameras are all, 11, 12 frames a second now. So we're not going to burn that. But when we open up the guide number controller on the D3 and drop it down 1 stop to half power, no more. The difference is no more. The D2J does not compare at that point. And at the setting that is half power, which we call guide number 22 on the D3, that particular setting has got an audible and a real fast recycle that allows you to shoot before it's fully recycled. Now, you might say, well, I don't want to do that. Well, you don't have to. You can wait for the full recycle, which is about a second at that setting, or you can go with the 0.6 second recycle if you're shooting real fast. Now, let me illustrate why this might be an advantage for you. I shoot a lot of pictures of fast moving things, sharks, sea lions, the fastest thing in the ocean. and they come in and your exposure is right and your guide number, your strobe power control is set at the right place at maybe 2 feet, 2.5 feet, and bam, you get that really nice shot. That exposure is really good. And then what happens when that animal decides to come in close? Sea lion wants to inspect their reflection in the dome port. Shark wants to see if you're the guy with the bait. So all of a sudden, that distance is halved, and the whole equation is thrown off, and it's very easy to overexpose something. So at 22, the 22 setting on the guide number control in D3, it will fire at a much lower power, but still give you a reasonable exposure for something that came in real rapidly. And you didn't have time to change one strobe, let alone 2 strobes or an f-stop or anything else. So that's a big plus. At the next power setting down, which is guide number 16, which would be equate to quarter power. It's a real fast strobe, and it's so fast at that point, there's practically speaking no real discernible recycle time. I've noticed that every once in a while it'll drop a frame. So I'll go for my 11 frames a second on my R5. Is that right? Is that what R5 does? Isn't it 11 or 12 or something?
It's, yeah, 12 and 20 if you're using electronic, but 12 for.
Yeah, I don't use electronic because it drops the bit rate. So I stick with the regular. So at the guide number control setting, which is quarter power or F16, there really is no recycle time. You'll notice maybe every 5th or 6th, 7th frame once in a while will drop out, but that's about it. So I guess there's somewhat of a change going on there, or something happening enough electronically where it's not quite ready to fire again. And then when you go below that to the F11 setting, which is what I use for most images, and the images we're going to show you in a while, oddly enough, though, all the ones that I pulled out, I had set the guide number controller at F11. And that's 8th power. So there is definitely no recycle time there. I mean, you can shoot this thing as fast as you want at that point. Now, one of the things about the D2J was that, an underwater guide number of 32 in any little strobe like this creates an awful lot of heat. And the smaller the package, the less area there is to dissipate that heat into the water. Unfortunately, water dissipates heat very well. That's why we use it in the radiator of our car, right? So with the D3, we realized that had been a problem previously in the D2 and the D2J. We put a metal band in here to help dissipate the heat. So this is actually making contact with the water on the outside, so it can assist the cooling of this high-powered little tiny strobe. So that was another big advancement of this newer model.
So that's actually really cool. I was wondering, have you ever felt the heat itself, like when you're shooting with it?
You're up in the Northwest. I'm in California. Yeah. Most of the time we got the heavy gloves on. So even if I try to, I never think about it when I'm in Bon Air or Cocos or someplace like that. I'm usually too busy looking for a hammerhead or the next, tarpon that are going to swim by. So haven't really thought about this. It's a good point. I'll have to check that out. The other big difference, I think, that's very notable between the 2 strobes, the D2, D2J, and the D3, is the beam angle. We really wanted to go with a circular flash tube because everybody says, and I told the CNC engineers as well, circular flash tube is the way to go. Nice even beam, The problem is with what do we got here? 5, 6 bolts or so, with 4 little AA batteries. That's a lot of real estate to try and light up. And what that does when you have a lot of real estate to light up is that slows the recycle time. So initial designs showed right away that wasn't going to work. We would have a recycle time of probably around 2 seconds. And sure enough, when you look at most manufacturers' smaller strobe that is using a circular flash tube, yep, they've got that nice beam, but they really suffer in the recycle time. So they just don't sell as many of them because everybody goes for their bigger strobe. Bigger battery pack, bigger strobe can handle the extra real estate of that circular flash tube. So what we did instead was we created a little aspherical lens, little piece of plastic, basically. It cost an awful lot to create the mold for, but hey, it's in there. Toroidal lens, aspherical toroidal lens that goes over you can't really see it. I'll just hold this up so you can see what I'm talking about. There's the flash tube, the dual flash tubes. And they put this little lens, this little plastic lens over there. So what ends up happening is we get a much more similar to a circular flash tube look or lighting area out of those dual flash tubes. Not quite exactly the same, but quite a bit closer. And we do it without having to sacrifice recycle time. And we're still holding a 1.7 second recycle time at full power with a guide number of 33, which means you can shoot f11 at 3 feet actual distance. So that's pretty good. That's a pretty powerful or pretty power-packed little strobe. The beam angle compared to the native beam angle, I should say, of the strobe, just with the flash tubes, compared to the D2 D2J, the D2 D2J was 80 by 80. We're now 80 by 105. So across this horizontal plane, we've now got over 100 degrees without a diffuser, and of course 80 degrees this way. Now we've got a few different light modifiers. One of them is included. We include a 110-degree diffuser with the D3, and this gives you 100 by 110 degrees. And then we have an accessory light modifier for wide angle. The dome diffuser, this little guy will put you out to 150 degrees. Now they do suck up a lot of light, and these will suck up about a stop. These will eat up about a stop and a half, maybe a little bit more. I have never really used a light meter behind it, but I know just from having to power up the strobe just a little bit. But they have their place, and they are tools to use when you need them. So you can shoot the standard beam or one of these two diffusers, and the third light modifier is of course the snoot that we make for it. This snoot is probably worth talking about for a minute. I don't want to jump too far off the subject, but the snoot we used, we had another issue. We wanted to center the target light, and this target light is about, they claim, 4 times brighter than the D2 D2J. I don't know about that. I've never measured it. To my eye, it looks like maybe about twice as powerful as D2J. And there are 2 power settings for it, so you don't have to drain the battery if you don't need a lot. But because we couldn't put it in the center, because we didn't have a circular flash tube, we couldn't get it down the snoot very well. So we put a little reflector in the snoot. So this is built right in here. And when this is in place, the target light hits that little reflector and is directed right down the center of the snoot. Now, I don't know if the light's probably not right in here. You probably can't tell, but our snoot is also diffused. So there is a diffuser inside of this snoot as well to soften the light. One thing snoots will do, and especially if you're using multiple snoots, is create a very, very harsh shadow. So by diffusing that light a little bit, we do lose a little bit of the intensity, but let's face it, when using snoots, you're usually pretty close. So it's not a big deal with the strobe that's got a guide number of 33. That diffuser helps quite a bit. So those are your different light modifiers. And I think what I wanted to say about this overall was between the new electronics, the aspherical toroidal lens, this lens is also curved on the outside, aspherical curved, and the heat removal capabilities of this strobe. I mean, you've really got a very small package, which is very capable of doing anything a professional photographer wants or needs it to do. There's really nothing out there with a much higher guide number, if there even is anything with a higher guide number at this point. And that coupled with the fact that all these new cameras we're shooting, that, you know, everybody's raving about shooting ISO 1000 or even higher. I don't like to go that high underwater, but you know, ISO 640 is pretty reasonable. Even 800 looks pretty clean. And I would certainly not say don't go there if the giant squid and the sperm whale are fighting and you've got the Nat Geo cover for the next century. But I try to stay at a little lower ISOs than that. But still, I'm able to use higher ISOs than I was with my DSLR cameras. So when we've got more light sensitivity right from the base, how much more power do we really need? Now, one other thing about the strobe that I like to point out to people is if you read some of the fine print, it's not in everything, but this strobe was, I like to say, and maybe this is not 100% accurate, but I like to say it was designed around Eneloop Pro batteries. And I'm not, you know, fanboy for Eneloop trying to wave my flag for a brand. All I'm saying is that when the engineers set out to create this strobe, those were the chosen batteries. And they were the Eneloop Pro, which are the black ones, not the white ones. And they were the highest milliamp hour rating that you could get in there. Milliamp hour rating is just kind of a store of energy in the battery. So the higher that store of energy, the longer the batteries will last. So we were able to increase the number of flashes a little bit. With the D2, D2J, with Eneloop Pros, they would hold about 200 flashes with the nickel metal hydride rechargeables. I should mention these are rechargeable batteries for those that didn't know that. We're up to 220 now with the D3. So we got a few more flashes, about 10% more flashes or so. And then to contrast, so that all of you that are, even if you're using D2Js or even an older D2, I highly recommend you switch over to a good set of rechargeable nickel metal hydride batteries in around the 2500 milliamp hour range. And we, like I said, the Eneloops worked really, really well for our design purposes. But if you throw alkalins into these strobes, you'll find that the number of flashes is reduced by about 1/3 and the recycle time is doubled. So with a D3, you're looking at 3.4, 3.5 second recycle time. With a D2J, you're looking at about 3-second recycle time just by switching to alkalins. And you're going to get about 120 to 140 flashes out of a set of alkalins, which I think for most people, they would agree. I don't think anyone would argue much about that, but we do that easily in a dive, a number of frames.
Yeah.
So with alkalins, you could effectively have to change your batteries every dive. So again, highly, highly, highly recommend the Eneloop Pros, the black ones, in about a 2450, 2500 milliamp hour battery range. And folks, let's remember, we get an awful lot of strobes back at CNC and something's wrong with it. This is wrong. This isn't recycling right. And we pop a new set of fresh batteries in, recharged batteries, and everything's working. So the user just didn't realize they had just worn their batteries out. I've run into people that bought a brand new, these are like a $900 strobe. You got a $900 strobe, and what are batteries? $1, $1.50 a piece. And they don't put new batteries in. They're running 8, 9-year-old batteries. There's no reason to do that. No reason at all. I mean, we don't want to fill landfills either, but old batteries can be used in all kinds of things. I run them in my MacBook Pro or my keyboard for my iMac and my older mouse. There's all kinds of stuff you can still use them for. So I think that's a very important point.
Yeah, and I'm actually a bit guilty of that, but I do appreciate you clearing that up because that's a question we get often, which is what battery should we put there? And yeah, that makes it really clear, and I'm actually glad that the engineers are really focused on that too.
I hope I didn't step on anyone's toes out there retailing a different brand battery. I know there's some 2800 milliamp hour batteries and things out there. I don't know about every one of them. What I do know about the Eneloops is they hold their charge longer than anything I have ever seen. The numbers are staggering. I used to use a really high-end brand of 2800 milliamp hour AA's, and I thought, wow, I've got the hottest deal here. But man, if I did not charge those things, like within a couple of days of going out on a dive, they were dying on the second dive. And with the Eneloops, if I forget to charge them, if I charged them a week or 2, 3 weeks, a month before, they still seem to be holding pretty close to a full charge.
Yeah, I've experienced that too, and I've experienced that for the last 10 years, which is why I haven't actually replaced my Eneloops yet. But I will do that now that you said that. So. Great. Should we move on to a few photos, or was there any other point?
I wanted to say one more thing. I almost forgot.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is kind of basic, and maybe some people don't care, but
yeah,
we have 3 light modifiers, basically, a couple diffusers, and then a diffuse snoot. We also have, before I forget, a flash prism. On the bottom of the YS-D3 strobe, the D2, this will work with as well, D2J. This is the port, folks, that your fiber optic cables go in. Another thing we get a lot of calls and returns of strobes on, people are porting their fiber optic cables into these side things. And I really kind of wish we almost didn't have them. Those are there to daisy chain to a strobe that is ported to the camera here. So some strobe somewhere at the line's got to be ported to directly from here. The 6 o'clock position, if you're looking at the front face of the strobe, think about like a clock, 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock. I'm backwards here, so 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Did I do that right? I think so. So at the 6 o'clock position, that's the only place to put your fiber optic cable, unless you're going along with this daisy chain thing. It's in the manual too, so that confuses people. At any rate, that I didn't want to digress too much on that. Just figured I'd put it out there because we get a lot of calls about that and have to correct things, and people spend $20 shipping, sending it out. This flash prism plugs right in here instead of the fiber optic cable, which means that something's got to be over here attached to your camera by fiber optic cable. If you will point this flash prism somewhere pretty close to where that flash is reflecting off of a subject, no further than 3 feet away, it will trigger the camera for you. So what that means is that's a pretty cool little deal. I think these are like $50 or $75. They're pretty cheap.
Yeah.
And this is the only slave function port on here. These are not
Right.
your typical slave function trigger ports on there. They're slaved only. So there are 3 mounts. That was the thing I was getting to. This is the YS mount, the old YS mount that we used to sell with all the strobes. If you purchased a D2 or D2J, this is what you got, along with a ball mount. Well, we found that a lot of people just didn't care about this mount anymore. So it's still available. You can purchase it separately, but all of the D3s come with the standard ball mount. So this would, screw right into the bottom there. And just to make sure we had all the bases covered, we also created a 35-degree angled ball mount that can go in here. Now, what that does is a couple of things. If you're like me and you still like to use the electro sync cables, a ball mount doesn't leave you a lot of clearance there to insert and take that out, and sometimes just gets in the way a little bit too much. So having this angled ball like that gives that a little bit more clearance, and it also puts the strobe in almost a perfect position, because when you're shooting wide angle, you really want to pull your strobes back. If you're pulling your strobes back, this 35-degree angle is almost the exact angle I use on my strobes. So that's another really nice little accessory that you can add to it. And none of this stuff costs very much. All of our diffusers and snoots, everything is at, I think the highest price thing here is like $80. Some of them are 50, and of course this comes with it. So it comes with one diffuser and it comes with one ball mount. And you can add the YS mount, the 35-degree mount, the snoot, the dome diffuser, or the little flash prism. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff that you can use to modify your D3 to, customize the type of shooting that you do. That was all I wanted to say.
Yeah. No, it really does, lend itself to creative photography, and that's why I do love that strobe so much. Well, speaking of creative photography, let's take a look at some of our photos, and yeah, I guess, Andy, do you want to start with yours? I can put them up on the screen.
Sure.
Awesome. So let me go ahead and pull that up.
What I did was I gave Nirupam just a group of images to try and illustrate, how well the D3s work, of course. But I mean, let's face it, with any really good strobe and a good shooter, you could probably do the same type of work. But I'm going to talk to you about what some of the settings were, not to try and give you an instruction class on how to set your camera and your strobes, but to give you some idea of the amount of output this little D3's got. So on the D3, the light level controller, or the power controller is the easy way to say that. It sits on the right side of the back of the strobe. This is the mode control over here. So you can go manual, TTL, pre-flash. There are also 2 TTL modes in this. And when you turn the strobe on, not to get way off again, it's going to blink, and then there's your ready light. You can switch TTL modes. So this is this dark blue backlight. I don't know if you guys can see that or not. Dark blue backlight shows that you're in TTL mode. Green would show that you're in manual mode, and then orange would be for your pre-flash fiber optic cable mode. And most people don't use the electro sync cables anymore, but if you're in manual mode with electro sync cables, it would also be green. There are 2 TTL modes built in. So when you see that dark blue, that's what we call DS-TTL2. So it's the evolution of CNC's DS-TTL, or digitally slaved TTL. Now, some cameras just don't like it. And when you're connected with a regular DSLR and electro sync cable, if you've got an older TTL converter in one of those, they're going to like this mode better. So you push the target light button. I'm not going to blind myself here. And did that change color? Yeah, there we go. See that more aqua looking blue? I'm going to shut that modeling light off. There we go. So there's a more aqua blue. That's what they call just straight slave TTL. If you're having TTL issues with the strobe, one of the things to try is to switch it away from the dark blue TTL mode, which is again DS-TTL2, to standard slaved TTL. That may be enough to solve your problem. there's also something else you can do, and I can't really show you that on here so well, that you do through the target light button. I'm going to switch this back to DSTTL. There we go. And I'm going to turn that off. I don't need that anymore. But there is a custom mode that you can use. And there's a chart on the CNC website. And certain cameras will require a different mode. You can hold this button down while the guide number controller is set at F56, I believe. Refer to the manual to make sure I'm right here. And you hold this down and you'll get a white ready light back here. You can then change this to suit your particular camera. So what we run into when we're engineering these things is that there are manufacturers out there, because everyone has their own proprietary type of flash usage with their cameras, or flash readout with their cameras. In order for TTL to work, sometimes you're going to find that you need to change the setting on a D3 or a D2 or D2J, and that's that custom mode. Again, refer to the manual just to make sure I didn't say anything wrong here. I don't use that. I don't need to with my Canon. I shoot manual most of the time anyways. But it is there if you're having any kind of issues or difficulties. And don't forget that the D3 Mark I and can be firmware upgraded to the D3 Mark II status as well if you're a TTL shooter. Okay.
Yeah, no, appreciate the explanation for sure.
Yeah, so this picture is taken locally here in San Diego. This one is, let's see, find this in my notes here. Artificial reef, yes. This is on the NOSC Tower in San Diego, which was an old strange weather tower that they erected straight up, and then it fell down finally in a storm 20 years later or something like that. So it's got a lot of marine life on it, as you can imagine. Picture of a cabezon sitting on top of a scallop, and then my model, my wife Allison, in the background there. So this was shot at 1/200th of a second, f/13, ISO 400 with the standard diffuser. And standard diffuser is what I use most of the time for most of my images, unless I really want to soften up the light for one reason or another. And we'll have some other images where I'll show you some samples of where you might want to use that. Well, now when a camera is set at f11, aperture set at f11, that means that that's a kind of medium size opening to the aperture. So it takes a fair amount of light from the strobe reflected off the subject to illuminate the subject properly and get the right exposure. I had turned the strobe all the way down on the guide number power level controller to f11, which is 8th power. So this was shot at 8th power, which has basically no recycle time. So I could have shot this a million times. I probably fired it off 3 or 4 times real rapidly. So that will show you what this strobe will do. Go ahead and switch to the next image, and you're going to see a pattern here of this. So here's some Atlantic spadefish off the coast of southern Florida, West Palm Beach, with walkers diving. And the problem with these guys is they are really highly reflective. They're like shooting a chrome bumper on an old car. So for these, I use the dome diffusers. So it spread the light to 150-degree beam instead of giving me a heavy spotlight in one area, or what most people just call a hot spot. So by spreading the beam out and taking a little bit of the light away, the dome diffusers did a really nice job on the shiny fish. And with this school of fish, I shot 1/160th of a second. Not that that matters for the exposure, the strobe exposure, but f11 at ISO 500, and the guide number again, the power controller was set at 8th power, or f11. This was shot with a R5 and 8-15 at 15 millimeter. But here's a good case where the dome diffusers were the right tool at the right time.
Yeah, the light's beautiful and soft.
Yeah, nice and soft. Real hard to not over reflect on those silvery fish schools, and everybody that shot them knows exactly what I'm talking about. You get a real bright hot spot, probably some overexposure of some of the school that are closer to you, and then nothing off to the edges. So spreading the beam and diffusing it really helped. Now with the sea lion, most of these sea lion pups in the fall in Southern California will come up pretty close. This guy was probably just 1.5 feet, 2 feet off the dome board. And this particular one was shot at high shutter speed because sea lions are the fastest thing in the ocean. Again, I shot at f11, one of my favorite apertures for wide angle lenses. And that tends to be a sweet spot for wide angle lenses, around ISO 400. And with a standard diffuser, I didn't need to throw a lot of light. Now here, I didn't use the dome diffuser because there's a lot of stuff kicked up in the water because it's surgy, it's very shallow. As you might notice, the surface is just above our heads, a couple of feet away. And the sea lions, as they're playing, these are pups, they play and they just kick everything up. They make a mess, just like kids everywhere. So with this one, again, the light level controller is set at f11, so 8th power. Didn't need a lot of light, and yet you can see the amount of light that's still hitting the sea lion 1.5 feet, 2 feet away. This was shot with an R5 with an 8-15 lens at 15 millimeters.
Wow, nice. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great.
Another sea lion in the same area. Again, very, very shallow water, probably 4 feet of water above our heads. And again, standard diffuser. I don't want to throw a bunch of light around because it just lights all the particulate in the water. Probably could have even used the strobe without any diffuser at all. But I find that when there's a lot of particulate in the water, the standard diffuser tends to soften a little bit of that. It makes my work in Photoshop later, cloning out all the material I didn't want to light up, a little bit easier. This one, let's see, was 1/250th of a second. I just wanted to mention, even though I use the mechanical shutter on the R5, when you shoot in wide angle, you can cheat the shutter speed up a little bit. Its top shutter speed is 1/200th to be used with third-party strobes, which is what we're doing with CNC strobes basically here. That's called X sync speed. So the fastest I can shoot is supposedly 200. I was able to cheat it up because in a wide angle image, quite a bit of the image, the bottom particularly, is an available light image, and the only strobe lit image is the subject itself, especially when he's more centered like that. Something I learned way many years ago in the old Nikonus when the top X sync speed was only 1/60th or 1/90th of a second. Imagine being limited to that. That was really, and then we only had 36 exposures, so you can imagine why we threw most of them away most of the time. Just again, guide number, I was shooting f11. Guide number was power controller was set at f11. R5 with an 8-15, and this is actually shot at 8 circular, but the high resolution and the large image file that the R5 produces is so big, I was able to crop it down to this nice rectangular image like this. I think I blew some sun out over here. I can't remember what I didn't like about it, but I just cropped it all the way down. Otherwise, it might have been a throwaway image. And I still have a 65 megabyte file, which I found that just to be kind of amazing. So I wanted to share that. It's not really on the topic list here today, but just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I think I learned something new in your technique of, if you've got a lot of ambient light, you could actually bump up that shutter speed. So
you can cheat
I never thought about it that way before, but that's a really good idea.
Necessity, the mother of invention.
Yeah, exactly.
When I was limited to a 60th of a second, I tell you,
yeah,
it got me up to 1/125th of a second. Boy, that was like heaven sent.
Yeah, you probably learned pretty quick that way. Yeah.
I'll just laugh at that. Okay, this was on a really incredible day out at Farnsworth Banks behind Catalina. On the ocean side of Catalina, there's a relatively shallow water bank, starts at about 60 feet and drops around 100, 150 feet all the way around it. Large area, plenty of room for lots of divers to be on, but not too much room for boats to put anchors, which is good. These are half moon, these fish in the foreground, and what's behind it is not a structure. Believe it or not, that is huge schools of mackerel in 3 different sizes that polarize together in those sizes. It's so dark in the background, and I can't really explain this to you. I probably should have shot it on video, but there were so many mackerel over the top of Farnsworth Banks that the lights literally had gone out. So for shooting that day, I had to go to a slow shutter speed, 1/100th of a second, even though there was a lot of movement by the fish, opened up to f6.3 and bumped up the ISO to 1000, which is not a place I like to be. It's, all these new cameras are great when they test them topside and in the labs and even outside, outdoors and all that. But when you take them underwater, the blue channel really, gets morphed into this ugliness of noise if you go much above 1,000 ISO.
Yeah.
Of course, as cameras get better, next year maybe we'll be able to do 2,000 ISO, but the R5 gave me a pretty nice looking image at 1,000 ISO, and I was really hesitant to do it, but I needed it because it was so dark. Here again, the dome diffuser saved the day. So luckily I had these on already because I had some ideas, some thoughts about spreading the beam around on the typical clear water at Farnsworth for California, 70, 80 foot visibility, and beautiful backgrounds, multicolored hues of Corynactis, and sometimes the yellow zoanthids on an area of the bank called the yellow wall, a little bit deeper water, about 110 feet. But if you get something foreground subject to sit still in that, like a cabezon or an octopus or something for a few shots, really works nice. So you having the dome diffusers really helped with that. Now, would have helped with that. Now, as it turned out, they really helped with what happened that day, which we did not expect. Matter of fact, just a side note, the captain couldn't find the high spot on Farnsworth Banks because his sonar was bouncing off the dense fish schools. So we had to end up pre-boating it, Anyway, so that was with the dome diffuser. And again, this one was F4, not again, I should say, but F4 on the guide number controller. So I had the power way turned down. I think that's 1/16 or 1/24 power, something like that. I mean, the strobe was way down at ISO 1000, as you can imagine. And of course, I had a pretty open aperture as well. So if I hadn't had these, I don't think the image would have come off quite so well. And I needed the coverage because I had this circular image. I was not expecting this day at all, and just serendipity with these happening to be there.
Oh, yeah. That's that's quite a lot of fish.
Yeah,
I don't think I've seen them quite that dark before.
it was amazing. Bouncing off to Bonaire under the salt pier. This is a hawksbill turtle, and like they do typically, they don't hang around for divers very long out there. There's a lot of diving out there, so people chase the turtles, so they don't hold still. But he swam right over the top of me, which I thought I needed to thank him for. And I thought, well, let's try this straight up in those clear waters with a bright sun in the background, but blocking a bit of that sun with the pier itself, and then just shooting the belly of the animal. One of the tests for me of a strobe, and the whole original intent behind the idea behind the YS-250, which is something that I kind of penciled out for Japan. Of course, I didn't design it. I'm no engineer, but I told them that one of the things a pro needs is to be able to shoot against a very strong background, or strongly lit background, sorry. Usually straight up is what that means, or even against the sun. And what some of the most memorable shots you'll ever see will be some kind of an animal swimming in front of the sun. The sun's so strong that you've got to go to F16, F22, something like that to try and tone it down on the highest shutter speed you can get away with. But then with a high shutter speed like that, that reduces the distance that the strobe light will travel and reflect off the subject for proper exposure. So it's a great test of how powerful a strobe can be. And this is a good testimonial to the power of the YS-D3. I would have never thought this little strobe could have done this. I would have figured for sure I needed a set of YS-250s at full power. And with this particular shot, I don't think I was even at full power yet. The camera's set at f11, ISO 320, so I had the ISO down because of the bright background. And even at this, I was still at a quarter power setting. And probably, distance is part of the equation. I haven't added distance. I don't recall the exact distances on all these images. I'm not that good. But my guess was I was probably within about 2.5 feet of the subject with a Canon 8 to 15 fisheye at 15 millimeter. So that means that strobe really has output even against a bright background.
That's awesome. Nice.
And here again, a much larger animal against a bright background. Now, occasionally you get lucky, you're right place at the right time. This guy came over the top of a cleaning station at Cocos when I was preset for the darker waters of Cocos, hoping for a whale shark or a hammerhead to come, on a more horizontal plane down through the water column. And so I probably didn't quite set the camera the way I would have if I had had the time, but change the page of my notes here. see if I can recall what I did do here. I was at a fairly high, yeah, ISO 800, which was too high for that sun in the background. 200th of a second, so that was pretty good, but I was still open at f8. And this, believe it or not, was not the dome diffusers. I don't use those at Cocos often for sharks and hammerheads. I just had the standard diffuser, and you can see how nice and soft and spread evenly the light was there. I still feel like the background's maybe a hair too strong, and if I had had time, I would have dialed that down a bit. But guess where the strobe was? This is going to surprise you. It's just like the turtle. It's at quarter power. The strobes. So you know, guide number 11. It's like I keep saying. And of course, the ISO is at 800, so that's from 100. That's what 1, 2, 3 stops over 100. So that's up there. That would have been a comparable guide number of 3 times 33, or like a guide number of 99 underwater. But at any rate, that's pretty good result. And I had plenty of power to spare if I had needed it. I could have turned it up. And if I had been further away. And again, this was probably 4 feet from the subject, which is just, I mean, it's shocking to me how powerful these little strobes are, or how good the electronics and the new high output set of capacitors are in them. Okay, bouncing over to macro here. This is what they call a Spanish shawl nudibranch. These are found on the West Coast. I don't believe they're in the Atlantic at all. I don't think they're cosmopolitan. We have a lot of them in California, southern, and a fair amount in northern, and they go right down into Mexico, though I don't know the entire range. Beautiful, beautiful creature. Deep purple indigo body with the orange rhinophores on the back. And this is shot with the other light modifier with the snoot. Okay, so I always use when I do put snoots on my strobes for macro to try and get a black background like that. I'm trying to eliminate that. Well, I like to just call it the salad bowl effect. If I had just shot without the snoot, I would have been putting a 110-degree beam angle against the background of this thing. And though the nudibranch might have still stood out because it was closer, the subject itself was closer to the camera, the lens, than the background, I'd still have this real busy background. So one of the ways to eliminate a busy background like that and really make your subject pop is to black out the background. Everyone's seen the Blackwater images. Well, those are in mid-water, so there is no background. So it's pretty easy to do that. And that's how the guys that shoot the Blackwater stuff are able to get these really nice shots. They don't need to use snoots because there is no background to garbage up the image. But for most of us, we're down on the bottom looking around for nudibranchs, octopus, small fish, what have you. A set of snoots will do you very well there. And because the targeting light is pseudo-centered, it's not centered on the strobe, it's centered by the reflector in the snoot. It comes right down the barrel of the snoot. So you just turn your targeting lights on. I prefer to use them in low power rather than high power. Benefit is drains the battery of the strobe less, but it also doesn't scare the skittish subject. And yes, even a nudibranch is affected by bright hot lights on them. So the less time I spend on them and the lower the power of the target light, the better. You don't need, and target lights are not supposed to be for video. Some people are using them for video. It's like, buy a solo light, something like that for your video. They can be used, but that's really not the function. It's supposed to be the function of them. And I think they're only maybe at high, maybe they're 450 lumens or maybe 500 lumens. I've never measured them. So this was with an R5, an RF100 macro lens, and high shutter speed to help black out the background, of course, lower ISO 320. I shot this one at, looking at the wrong note there, sorry. The other macro note. I shot this one at f16, I believe, or f18. Those are usually one of my favorite apertures because aperture blades will diffuse the light and cause image degradation. But you don't want to shoot too wide open or you lose depth of field. So anyway, let's see here. And what was the Spanish shell? Here we go. So the guide number setting was f16. So I was at quarter power. So I shot these at quarter power, and the snoots eat up quite a bit of light. They're diffused as well. So again, plenty more power than I would have ever needed for this to expose this properly with the D3, even with snoots on it.
That's really impressive. Yeah, I wouldn't have expected quarter power at all for this shot.
Okay, back to Cocos. So everybody's favorite, the scallop hammerhead at Cocos. These shots quite often are taken further away than you really want to take them. So again, having a strobe with ample power can be a lot of help. My settings were 1/200th of a second shutter speed, f8, ISO 640, because the water this past season, July into August, was a little bit dark and a little bit murky, had a lot of rain. With sharks, I always use a standard diffuser unless I know I'm going to be up super, super close. I mean, basically shark on the dome port, which is kind of risky business, especially if it's a tiger shark or a great white or something like that. But these guys aren't a big worry, but the standard diffusers, because I needed the light to transmit further, I would not have wanted to use the dome diffusers. Although, as it turns out, the power setting, I probably could have used the dome diffusers if I wanted. Again, I shot this at quarter power on the D3s. R5 with the RF 14 to 35 lens. Great focal length for sharks. Tiger shark. I think this was pretty much the same thing. Now, this is off Florida. Water was a little brighter, although it was deep, probably about 90 feet. The tiger shark was 1/200th of a second, f11 at ISO 640. Standard diffusers, once again, my favorite for most sharks. Guide number set at f11 on the strobe, which means quarter power. R5 with an 8 to 15 and a by the way, I had forgotten to mention that there's a converter from EOS to RF lens for the Canon 8 to 15 that you have to put in there. So again, more power than you need by a couple of stops. And this is probably the final image, the final macro image. This is a yellowfin fringe head. And I really wanted to get those spiky things in the background, which are the side of a tiny little purple sea urchin. And so for this shot, I did things just a little bit differently because I didn't want those to be stealing the focus from the little fish's eye there. So 200th of a second to keep the background darker, f11. So I opened up a little more than I normally open up. That did limit the diffusion, but it also limited my depth of field, and a lower ISO 320. Shot with snoots. So once again, I directed both lights right at the little fish's head and his eye. And I used on the power setting f16, which is quarter power. So this was with an R5 and an RF 100 macro lens also.
So just to clarify here, you actually used 2 snoots on this one.
I used snoots on both strobes. Yeah, I don't want to throw light all over the place when I'm shooting macro. Most of the macro I shoot is downward or horizontal angles, and what happens is any light that you throw back there, even though maybe it's a stop less light, confuses the viewer as to what's subject and what's background, because so many of these subjects have strange frilly stuff like this one on his head. Now he's at least got an eye, he or she. The nudibranch doesn't even have an eye. So for the average viewer, maybe doesn't dive, maybe never seen a nudibranch like that. They just don't even know what they're looking at when the background is competing for the viewer's attention as the foreground subject. So with this, I figured the spikes were good enough. They were straight lines. They just, to me, kind of added to the composition a little bit, or the interest, but I needed a lot of light on the fish and not much light in the background. And I didn't want that focus to be too strong in the background either, because the viewer's eye always goes to the brightest lit point in the image. Hopefully that's on the subject, and the sharpest focus. Hopefully that's also on the subject.
Right. Yeah, no, that was a great technique for the shot. It's really hard to get complex backgrounds to mix with a subject. Yeah, and that looks like all of Andy's photos. So I guess from here we can move on to a couple of my photos. So I'll go ahead and reshare my screen. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, I actually have kind of a different shooting style than Andy, and I actually use these tools in different types of situations. So could be interesting to really see, you know, one of these tools being used and how for different types of shooters. So for this one here, and Andy, you can see this properly, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this one was with the standard diffusers. I was shooting in a really dark place, and I just wanted to try to get a little bit of light on this fish, but still have this nice dramatic background with a gradient kind of shooting towards the sun. What I was worried about was a hot spot on the fish itself, and I think you can tell that a spherical lens, or the lens that goes over the flash tube, it did a really good job here. It didn't really, it kind of dispersed the light evenly, and I didn't get a hot spot on that white part of the fish. So this one is also with the standard diffusers. I actually didn't use a snoot on this, even though it looks like a snoot photo. So this is just showing that, you know, you can actually shoot subjects without that snoot and still get a black background. It's just a little bit more tricky. So in this case, I think I had the strobe directly over the subject, kind of to the side, and I wanted to create some harsh lighting. So a lot of the beam was going towards my port rather than the background behind the subject. And that's how you get that darker background. But also, like Andy was saying before, if you open up your aperture, you can separate your subject from the background a lot better too.
I think one of the things he's saying is that he positioned the strobe at a 90-degree angle to the subject. So if this was the subject, he's on top, you could be at the side, you could be below it, wherever you want your light to come from. But by doing this, he's not throwing a bunch of light into the background.
Exactly, yeah. So a lot of that light will actually end up hitting your port rather than the background behind the subject. So you get a little bit of the subject, and then it gets blocked out by the port, and then you don't get anything behind that. So this one was an interesting one. I know Andy was saying that he didn't like to use the dome diffusers in low visibility. I tried it, and this is where I tried it. So this was an interesting situation. I'd say the visibility here was about, I'd say between 2 to 5 feet. So really, really low vis. But I really want to get these shot of these anemones. And I thought, well, you know, it's low vis. The anemones are kind of dispersed. I mean, you have this anemone that's behind this other one. So I thought maybe the dome diffusers here would work. What I was worried about is what Andy said. You know, you do get a little bit more coverage with that light, so you do get more backscatter that's lit up. But what I found in this situation, it was fine, because in a lot of cases, the backscatter that is lit up is very fine. So if you have very fine particles in the water, like I did on this day, you might be able to see it if you zoom in really close. Like you can see a little bit of these particles right here, but it's still not super defined. And so that's why it worked in this case. And then I also didn't get a hot spot on this bright white anemone. So I think in this case, the dome diffusers were good, but in general, I think Andy's right. Like you do kind of want to have clear water so that you don't get those really fine backscatter particles.
Well, it's it's really a matter of how much, here's a technical term for you, how much crap is floating around and how big it is. It looks to me like the dome diffusers were a really good choice here, because I think even though your visibility was limited, I think the crap, the particulate in the water was real fine, real small. So that was limiting visibility, but you're not gonna, with the way the dome diffusers are built and the way they suck up the light or absorb the light, you're actually better off using them in an image like this, where it's just limited visibility, but not a bunch of junk in the water. I think what I was trying to say was, with the sea lions or any place where there's surge and the water's kicked up, you get particulate that's quite large, because
like sand,
water's expensive. So this is a great use for the snoots here. This looks beautiful. And you avoided a lot of hot spot.
Yeah, the domes definitely helped with the hot spot. You can see one forming at the top right here. You know, in some cases when there's such limited light, that's going to happen. But the domes did a huge job in diffusing that as well. So
probably you just maybe you had a strobe up high there and it was just a little closer.
It was just a little bit too close, and it was surgy, so that was kind of
right. You just didn't catch it. If you had pulled it back, it probably would be perfect all the way around. So I think that's an excellent use of those dome diffusers, Nirupam.
Thanks. So I just kind of like, actually, so I wanted to go through this and then another photo. So this is with the standard diffusers, just on a standard wide angle scene of some black coral that I took in the Sea of Cortez. And I had some divers in the background as silhouettes. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to actually compare this with this photo right here, which had the dome diffusers. And the reason that I chose the dome diffusers here and not here is because in this case, I'm really close to the coral. But with the dome diffusers, when you're really far and you've got a huge wall, and you can see the size of the diver, this wall is like another good 20 feet below. And you really need that coverage. The dome diffusers do the trick. This is with 2 strobes, and the light was diffused enough to really get the whole reef, but still have that contrast and that trauma. So I thought that was kind of a neat application. So this is just a standard macro photo. I think it's always good to show, this is what you can do with just the strobes by themselves, standard diffuser, standard macro photo. I really think the colors turn out great. And it was just a, nice, even lighting. And it kind of made the shrimp here glow. This is a really, really tiny shrimp. I was using a Nikon 105mm macro with a +13 Kraken diopter on top. So this thing is like, size of maybe half my pinky or something. And I think the strobes did a great job of bringing out the colors and bringing out the details with how clear it actually was. Now, this is a good example of what you can do with a fast sync speed. So I was at a lower power here. It was a darker day, also in the Sea of Cortez. And these angelfish, or anybody that have experience with king angelfish, they're impossible to shoot. They'll always turn away. You'll get a lot of fish butts, but you'll never get the head. So on this day, I was actually hiding behind a rock, and I waited for this angelfish to come up. It came right up from behind the rock, and I just laid on that shutter. I think I was shooting at 5 frames a second. Every frame came out in this series. I think I only had a series of 4 photos or something, but every frame came out and I just picked the best one. And I think the lighting looks fantastic. In this case, I only used 1 strobe. You can see it's got this like nice shadow behind it. I think that helps separate the subject from the background, which was a little bit, because of the aperture I was using, you can see the background too. So sometimes having that 1 strobe and creating like just a single spotlight effect kind of looks cool.
Yeah, that looks great. And that is really sharp, sharp, sharp. That exposure is perfect. Any more exposure, you really would have started to, turn the yellow kind of white.
Exactly. Yeah. So I like how it's a little bit deeper with the blues, but the yellows are just right.
Nice.
So I'm actually going to skip this one and go to this one. So this is just a standard reef scene. Now this is taken in the Pacific Northwest in very limited visibility, but I just wanted to show, how good the coverage is. You can really use these strobes to, and I noticed this about Andy's photos too. You can use these strobes to really even out the lighting on the foreground and the background and make it look like a really natural transition. And part of that is just the new shape where you have this 105-degree horizontal coverage. You don't need like the dome diffusers for that. I wasn't using the dome diffusers here, but you can still get that nice transition between the foreground and background.
Yeah, that's just even all the way across. I mean, from left to right, on the right side, that pink is a little brighter than the orange over on the left, and the orange is even a little further away, which is always going to reduce the exposure, but that's just really, really even.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so this isn't a great photo, but it's unedited, and I did that on purpose. I wanted to show you guys what I call the lighting test, and I basically took, I think, 5, 6, maybe 7 frames. I took about 4 frames out of this, and I shot at half power with a shutter speed of 5.5 frames per second. So that's not, the highest shutter speed, but it's a good medium shutter speed that I think most photographers would be plenty happy with shooting fast subjects. And I just want to see what is the change from frame to frame when you're shooting a little bit quicker than the recycle time, but again, that the strobes, they can fire when they're not fully recycled. So, when the capacitors aren't fully charged. So I'll just flip through these photos real quick. You can see this is the first frame. Second frame, it's a little darker. But it's still usable. Third frame, again, a little bit brighter as it recycled. Fourth frame, a little darker, and there you go. So those are the 4 frames. I personally think that the difference between this frame and this frame is not enough for me to throw away either of them. They're both usable shots. They both have color in them. And that's 5.5 frames per second at half power. Again, like if I was like Andy and I was shooting at quarter power, it wouldn't even matter. You probably wouldn't even see the difference between the frames. But the fact that this difference is so minimal. It's like,
at half power, it allows you to shoot it before the capacitor is full charged.
exactly. So that's why you're seeing that difference in exposure,
Right.
but it's not enough to make these photos not usable. And that's what I wanted to show, is that even if you're pushing the strobe to its limits, even if you're shooting half power and you're going quicker than it can go, it really can keep up. And I turned both of these photos into usable images.
Oh, it seems like it'd be pretty easy. I mean, that when I look at these two, I look at the brighter one and I think, okay, I want to take the slider and bring that down a little bit.
Yeah,
I look at the darker one, I want to bring the slider and bring that up, just probably equal amounts, but different directions.
Yeah, so you're probably getting about the same amount of total data in the image itself.
Amazing.
So you're not really losing anything per se. And
yeah, that's a great test.
Yeah, I think it's
not an exciting picture, but a great test.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But it could be an exciting photo once you fix it up a bit in Lightroom. So,
yeah, we need to go out and do it with a shark or something really.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, the Pacific Northwest, most of the subjects here are pretty slow. Cold water means you have a lot of animals that are kind of conserving energy.
But for testing, I mean, that's really much more scientific. You know that this rock with these anemones on it didn't move. So
exactly. And you know your colors, it's same lighting conditions. Yeah.
Right.
And then this is just another shot actually showing TTL. And I took this with a smaller Olympus camera. I wanted to use a camera that, some of our compact shooters would use. And I wanted to try the TTL and just see, how well does it do? I think it did great. I mean, I really didn't have to fiddle with this image too much. I think the exposure is pretty accurate. It did a good job considering it's an anemone and the tentacles are pretty clear. So I thought it metered it quite well. And this is actually before the D2 or the D3 Mark II version. This is the Mark I. So the TTL should work even better now. And that's pretty exciting for me.
Nirupam, do you remember which Olympus that was?
Yeah, so this was actually the Olympus EPM1. So it's an older, like first generation mirrorless.
That, and one of the problems with TTL is when it sees a large area of darkness in a frame, it will tend to overexpose. And there's, not a large area, but a fair amount of real darkness in that frame. So that's pretty accurate. And so of course you're driving this with the onboard, the camera's flash, right?
Yes, exactly. So I had an on-camera flash, and the trick to making sure that your exposures are good is to remember to be in spot metering. So that's a really important thing to do.
So spot metering was the trick for you. Okay.
Yeah. If you're in spot metering, then it'll use that focus point to meter the rest, and then I think that helps improve TTL quite a bit, actually.
Do you remember did you adjust the EV at all on the camera or the strobe?
In this case, the EV's at 0. Yeah, it did really well. On the strobe,
that is spot on, man.
Yeah, I might have. It's possible I might have dialed it down a notch or two on the strobe, but I don't think so. And the reason I would have done that is just for backscatter. If you want to eliminate backscatter, you underexpose a little bit.
Yeah, that little Olympus has got some pretty accurate TTL, and so the signal it sent to the strobe was really what did it. So that's a great combination for you compact shooters right there. YS-D3 and the Olympus.
Yeah.
Wow.
Olympus shooters, I think, like you should look at the D3s. I think it does a good job, especially if you guys are shooting with like the OM5 Mark III or the OMD-EM5 Mark III, sorry, or the OMD-EM1 Mark III. I think those are both very good applications, and even the new OM system OM1, I think, would be really good for this.
Wow, impressive.
And yeah, I guess that's all my photos. So that's pretty much it. Andy, did you have any final thoughts or anything you wanted to say?
I don't think so. I'd just like to kind of wrap it up by reminding everyone that, what I started out with, the amazing difference I found in this strobe when I was comparing it with my favorite strobe of all time, the YS-250, which I no longer shoot. So, there's my testimonial. Of course, I work for CNC, but remember, I also work as an underwater photographer. And for me, the underwater photography part has always been foremost and the first. So I'm sure I'm a salesman, but I, feel like I try to give a fairly honest rendition of what I'm seeing underwater so that it'll help people, because my bottom line is if people are happy with underwater photography, they'll eventually come along and buy one of my products, and that makes us all happy. So I'm here to help. And if anyone has any questions, you can always email me, and I'll pick it up as quick as I can. I'm pretty busy, not always in the office, but thank God I don't like to be in the office. I'd much rather be underwater. But I think that's it. Thanks, Nirupam. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. So for those of you that are watching, remember you can drop a comment or question below. We'll answer it right away. You can send us an email as well. If you're interested in these strobes, I have a link in the description, so you can go right to our site and get them. If you have any questions or need help with that sale, you can email us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com. If you like the video, make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can see more great content. I try to have Andy on as a guest because he's super helpful, and I learn something new every time I have him on. And these strobes have been great. So with that, I hope to see you guys out there shooting, and thanks very much.
Thank you.